The wind cut across the plains like a blade, sharp and unforgiving, carrying with it the scent of snow that hadn't yet fallen. In the small ranching town of Culbertson, near the North Dakota border, 38-year-old helicopter pilot Jack Brennan finished his coffee at the counter of Betty's Diner, leaving $2 beside his empty cup. Outside, the sky hung low and grey, threatening weather that would make flying dangerous, but Jack had flown through worse. He'd spent 3 tours in Vietnam, navigating his UH-1 Huey through monsoons and enemy fire, and he'd come home with nothing but a limp in his left leg and nightmares that woke him most nights before dawn. Now he made his living flying supply runs for ranchers and oil field crews scattered across the vast emptiness of eastern Montana, work that paid enough to keep him and his 12-year-old daughter Lily fed and housed in the small bungalow they rented on 3rd Street. Betty Freeman wiped down the counter and watched him go, noting how he moved with the careful deliberation of a man who knew his body's limits. She'd known Jack since he returned from the war 2 years ago, quiet and haunted, speaking only when necessary. His wife had left him 6 months after he came back, unable to live with the stranger he'd become, taking nothing but her clothes and leaving Lily behind because she said she couldn't handle a child either. The whole town knew the story, whispered about it in checkout lines and church pews, but no one said anything to Jack's face. Before we continue with Jack's story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment, letting me know where you're watching from. Your support helps me bring more stories like this one to you. That morning, December 14th, Jack was scheduled to fly to a remote drilling site 80 miles northeast near the Missouri River Breaks to deliver equipment and medical supplies. The crew there had been stranded for 3 days due to mechanical failures with their ground vehicles, and the foreman had called Jack personally, offering double his usual rate. Jack needed the money. Lily's school was organizing a trip to Helena after Christmas, and he'd promised her she could go. He kissed his daughter goodbye at 7:30, her blonde hair still tangled from sleep, and told her he'd be back before dark. She watched him from the front window as his truck disappeared down the street, her face pressed against the cold glass, breath fogging the pain. The helicopter, a civilian Bell 47G painted forest green with rust spots along the tail boom, sat on a concrete pad behind Vernon's Aviation, the only flight service in 3 counties. Jack performed his pre-flight inspection methodically, checking fuel levels, rotor integrity, and control surfaces despite the cold that made his fingers ache. Vernon himself, a barrel-chested man in his 60s who taught Jack the basics of civilian flying, came out with a thermos of coffee and a worried expression. "Weather's turning," Vernon said, squinting at the sky where clouds were building to the north, dark and heavy with moisture. "Might want to wait it out." Jack shook his head, accepting the thermos but not the advice. "I've flown in worse," he said, and it was true. He'd navigated his Huey through conditions that would have grounded any sane pilot, flying treetop level under fire near Hugh City, with wounded men bleeding out in the cargo bay. Vernon didn't argue further. He knew better than to push Jack once his mind was set. At 8:15, Jack lifted off, the Bell's engine whining as the rotors bit into the frigid air, and headed northeast across the empty landscape where snow-dusted plains stretched to the horizon, broken only by isolated ranch buildings and the dark lines of windbreaks. He made radio contact with the drilling site at 9:45, his voice crackling through static to confirm his estimated arrival time of 10:30. The foreman, a man named Dutch Callahan, acknowledged the transmission and said the crew would have the landing zone cleared and ready. That was the last anyone heard from Jack Brennan. When he failed to arrive by 11, Callahan tried raising him on the radio, but received only silence. By noon, with snow beginning to fall in thick, wet flakes that reduced visibility to less than half a mile, Callahan contacted Vernon's Aviation to report that Jack had never shown up. Vernon immediately called the sheriff's office, and by 1 o'clock a search effort was underway, hampered by the deteriorating weather that had become a full blizzard. 2 other pilots from neighboring towns attempted to fly the route Jack would have taken, but both were forced to turn back within 30 minutes due to zero visibility and dangerous wind conditions. Ground crews mobilized, but searching 80 miles of empty prairie in a blizzard was nearly impossible. The storm lasted 3 days, dumping 14 inches of snow across the region and making any aerial search completely impossible. When the weather finally cleared on December 17th, 8 aircraft, including 2 Montana Air National Guard helicopters, began a coordinated search pattern along Jack's projected flight path. They found nothing. No wreckage, no debris field, no emergency locator beacon signal. The Bell 47G and Jack Brennan had simply vanished into the white expanse as completely as if they'd never existed. Lily waited at home, cared for by neighbors who brought casseroles and spoke in hushed voices about tragedy and God's mysterious ways. She sat at the kitchen table doing homework she couldn't concentrate on, listening for the sound of her father's truck in the driveway, a sound that never came. At 12 years old, she understood that people could disappear. Her mother had done exactly that, but she couldn't accept that her father, who had survived a war that killed so many, could vanish flying a routine supply run over Montana. The official search continued for 2 weeks, expanding the search radius to include areas well beyond Jack's planned route, considering the possibility that he'd been blown off course by the storm or had attempted to find an emergency landing site. Volunteers from Culbertson and surrounding communities spent their Christmas searching frozen fields and coulees, finding nothing but the bones of long-dead cattle and abandoned farming equipment from another era. On January 3rd, 1973, the Montana Department of Aeronautics officially suspended the search, classifying Jack Brennan as missing and presumed deceased. His Bell 47G was listed as lost, and the case file was archived with dozens of other unsolved disappearances that accumulated in rural counties where vast distances and harsh weather could swallow people whole. Lily was placed in the temporary custody of her Aunt Rachel, her father's younger sister who lived in Billings and worked as a nurse at St. Vincent Hospital. She packed Lily's belongings into cardboard boxes, including the shoebox under her bed, where Jack kept his war medals, and a photograph of himself in his flight suit standing beside his Huey in Vietnam, young and unbroken. Rachel tried to provide stability, enrolling Lily in a new school and taking her to a counselor who specialized in grief therapy. But Lily remained convinced that her father was alive somewhere, that he would come back just as he had come back from Vietnam, and she refused to accept the sympathy and condolences offered by well-meaning adults who spoke of closure and moving forward. Years passed with no answers. The case file in the sheriff's office gathered dust, occasionally reviewed by new deputies who wondered about the helicopter pilot who'd vanished without a trace. But there were no new leads to follow, no evidence to re-examine. Lily grew up carrying the weight of not knowing, graduating high school in 1978 and attending Montana State University, where she studied geology, drawn to a field that involved searching and discovering things hidden beneath the surface. She married a ranch hand named David Perkins in 1983, and they settled in Great Falls, where she worked for the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology. She had 2 children, both boys, and named the elder Jack after the father she'd never stopped missing. But the question of what had happened that December morning in 1972 remained unanswered, a void at the center of her life that nothing could fill. The drilling crew that had been waiting for Jack's delivery in 1972 was shut down within 6 months, the well proving unproductive and the company abandoning the site. Dutch Callahan, the foreman who'd been the last person to speak with Jack by radio, died of a heart attack in 1989, taking with him any memories that might have provided context. Vernon's aviation closed in 1985 when Vernon himself passed away, his hangar and equipment sold to a crop dusting operation from North Dakota. The people who had known Jack personally grew older, retired, moved away, or died, and the story of the vanished helicopter pilot became one of those local legends that old-timers mentioned occasionally in bars, but that younger generations had never heard of. May 2017, Fort Peck Reservoir. The drought had been severe, the worst in 30 years according to meteorologists who tracked such things. Fort Peck Reservoir, the massive impoundment on the Missouri River created by a Depression-era dam, had dropped to levels not seen since the early 1950s. The receding water revealed things that had been submerged for decades. Old homesteads from before the dam was built, skeletal remains of trees, foundations of buildings from vanished towns. On May 7th, two fishermen from Glasgow named Tom Hendricks and his son Luke motored their boat into a narrow inlet on the reservoir's northern arm, following a tip about good walleye fishing in shallow water. What they found instead was metal. At first, Tom thought it was an old tractor or farm implement, the kind of debris that littered the reservoir bottom in areas that had once been agricultural land. But as they got closer, cutting the outboard motor and drifting in the shallow water that was barely 3 feet deep, Luke pointed and said, "Dad, that's a helicopter." The wreckage sat in the mud and silt, partially buried but clearly identifiable. The distinctive bubble canopy of a Bell 47G, crushed and covered in decades of sediment but unmistakable in its shape. The tail boom had separated and lay 10 feet away, and the rotor blades were gone entirely, probably torn off on impact or carried away by currents over the years. Tom used his cell phone to call the Valley County Sheriff's Office, and by late afternoon, deputies had arrived along with investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board and the Montana Department of Justice. The location was puzzling. The inlet was approximately 40 miles northeast of Culbertson, well within the range of Jack's flight path, but in a direction that made no sense if he'd been heading to the drilling site. The NTSB team marked the site with buoys and waited for water levels to drop further before attempting recovery operations. 3 weeks later, when the water had receded another 2 feet, a specialized team used portable pumps and excavation equipment to expose the wreckage fully and prepare it for lifting. The helicopter's registration numbers, though corroded and partially obscured by algae and silt, were still legible, N3847G. Records confirmed it as the Bell 47G that had been piloted by Jack Brennan on December 14, 1972. Inside the crushed cockpit, investigators found skeletal remains still strapped into the pilot's seat, along with personal effects that had survived 45 years underwater, a waterproof watch that had stopped at 10:17, a metal lighter engraved with a military unit insignia, and a wedding ring that Jack had continued wearing despite his divorce. But the most significant discovery was a small waterproof flight bag wedged beneath the seat, the kind pilots used to store maps and documents. When the bag was opened at the NTSB facility in Helena, investigators found its contents remarkably well preserved due to the thick rubber sealing that had kept water out for decades. Inside was Jack's logbook, its pages water-stained but legible, and a handheld tape recorder, the kind that had been common in the early 1970s, used by pilots to record flight notes and observations. The recorder was a Sony TC55, a durable model known for its reliability, and despite being submerged for 45 years, it had remained sealed in its leather case inside the waterproof bag. The NTSB's audio forensics team carefully extracted the cassette tape and, using specialized equipment designed to handle degraded media, transferred the recording to digital format. The tape contained Jack's voice. Valley County Sheriff Kyle Anderson personally drove to Great Falls to notify Lily, now Lily Perkins, A woman of 57, with grey threading through her blonde hair and the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades working outdoors. He sat in her living room, the same living room where photographs of her father in his flight suit hung on the wall next to pictures of her own children, and told her that after 45 years they'd found him. Lily didn't cry. She'd done her crying decades ago. But her hands shook as Sheriff Anderson explained about the tape recorder and asked if she wanted to hear what her father had said in his final moments. She said yes. The sheriff played the recording on a digital player, the quality remarkably clear, despite the tape's age, and Jack Brennan's voice filled the room, speaking calmly and deliberately in the voice Lily had heard in her dreams for 45 years, but had never expected to hear again in waking life. The recording. December 14th, 1972, approximately 1000 hours. This is Jack Brennan, November 3847 Gulf. His voice was steady, professional, the tone of a man accustomed to emergency situations and trained to maintain composure. I'm recording this because I don't think I'm going to make it out of this situation, and someone needs to know what happened. Static crackled, and there was the sound of the helicopter's engine, rough and uneven, missing on at least one cylinder. At approximately 0950 hours, I encountered unexpectedly severe weather conditions approximately 30 miles northeast of Culbertson. Visibility dropped to near zero in heavy snow and high winds. I attempted to maintain course, but experienced significant turbulence that affected control stability. His breathing was audible between words, quick and shallow, the sound of a man managing fear through discipline. At 0955, I experienced a catastrophic mechanical failure. Oil pressure dropped to zero, and I observed smoke from the engine compartment. I immediately initiated emergency procedures and began looking for a landing site, but visibility was less than 100 feet and I was over broken terrain. There was a pause, the sound of the engine coughing and Jack's muttered curse that was barely audible. I managed to reduce altitude and airspeed, but I was losing power rapidly. I could see water ahead. I think the Missouri River, but I'm not certain of my exact position. The storm blew me off course, and my compass was giving inconsistent readings, possibly due to the engine damage. Another pause, longer this time, and the sound of something metallic grinding against itself with a shriek that made even the seasoned sheriff wince. "Engine has seized. I'm going in." His voice remained calm, almost conversational, as if he were describing something happening to someone else. Auto-rotation is difficult due to wind conditions, but I'm managing descent rate. I'm going to try to put her down on the water if I can reach it. If not, I'm hitting ground at approximately 40 knots, which is survivable but not ideal. The sound of wind increased dramatically, howling against the microphone, and the engine noise changed to a high-pitched whine before cutting out entirely. 50 feet. Water is right below me. I'm going to... The impact sound was tremendous, a crash that distorted the recording, followed by the sound of breaking glass and the groan of metal tearing. Water rushed in immediately, audible as a roar that overwhelmed all other sounds. Jack's voice came again, strained now, pain evident in every syllable. Impact on water. The aircraft is sinking. I'm trapped. My leg is pinned by the control panel which collapsed on impact. I can't free it. The sound of him breathing, harsh and ragged, struggling against something that wouldn't yield. The water is rising fast. It's up to my chest. I don't have much time. There was a long pause. Just the sound of water and his labored breathing. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. No longer the professional pilot making a report, but a father speaking to a daughter he knew he'd never see again. "Lily, if you ever hear this, baby, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I won't be there to see you grow up. I'm sorry I won't be there to walk you down the aisle someday, or meet your children, or any of the 1,000 other things a father should be there for." His breathing was becoming more difficult, the water clearly higher now, and his words came in gasps. "I want you to know that you're the best thing I ever did in my life. Better than anything I accomplished in the war, better than any mission I ever flew. You're smart and brave and kind, and I know you're going to do amazing things." A coughing fit interrupted him, the sound of someone fighting for air. "Don't let this define you, Lily. Don't spend your life wondering what happened or blaming yourself for something you had no control over. Live your life fully. Be happy. That's all I want. Just be happy and know that your dad loved you more than anything in this world." Another pause. Shorter now, urgency creeping into his voice as the water continued rising. "The water is at my neck. I'm going to try one more time to free my leg, but I don't think—" The sound of him straining, grunting with effort, the creak of metal. Then a gasp, sharp and involuntary, and his voice again, weaker now. Can't do it. The cold is making everything numb anyway." More coughing, wet and harsh. "Tell Rachel thank you for taking care of my girl. Tell Vernon his aircraft flew well right up until the end. This wasn't mechanical failure from poor maintenance. Something happened to the engine that I couldn't prevent." His breathing had become increasingly labored, each inhalation a struggle. "I'm not afraid. I've been ready for this since Vietnam. I should have died a dozen times over there, and I've been living on borrowed time anyway. I wish I'd had more time with Lily, more time to be the father she deserved instead of the broken man I became." The water sounds were overwhelming now, and his voice was barely audible above them. "Water is over my mouth. I'm tilting my head back to breathe, but there's maybe 30 seconds left. Lily, remember I love you. Remember that every single day. Your dad loves you. Your dad—" The sound of water filled the recording completely, and then there was a final cut-off gasp before the tape continued running with only the muffled sound of water, and eventually silence as the recorder's mechanism finally stopped. The sheriff turned off the player. Lily sat motionless on her couch, her face expressionless, staring at nothing. After a full minute she stood, walked to the window and looked out at the spring afternoon, where her grandchildren were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying through the glass. "Thank you for bringing this to me," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "After all these years, at least I know he was thinking of me at the end." The investigation. The NTSB's final report on the incident, released in September 2017, provided technical answers to questions that had lingered for 45 years. Examination of the recovered wreckage revealed that the Bell 47G had suffered a catastrophic engine failure due to a fractured oil line, a failure that would have been impossible to predict or prevent through normal maintenance procedures. The fracture had likely occurred due to metal fatigue exacerbated by extreme cold, causing immediate oil loss and subsequent engine seizure. Analysis of Jack's flight path, reconstructed from the crash site location and his radio communications, showed that the unexpected severity of the December storm had blown him approximately 15 miles off course to the east. His attempt to find an emergency landing site in near-zero visibility while managing a failing aircraft had been textbook correct, demonstrating the skill and composure expected of a pilot with his training and combat experience. The decision to attempt a water landing rather than risking a ground impact in broken terrain was sound, though ultimately the helicopter had struck the water with sufficient force to crush the cockpit structure and trap him. The reason the wreckage hadn't been found in the original 1972 search was simple geography and timing. The inlet where Jack had gone down was in an area that had been deeply submerged, the helicopter sinking into soft silt that quickly covered it. The search pattern had focused on the direct route to the drilling site and surrounding areas, not accounting for the degree to which the storm could have pushed him off course. Additionally, the emergency locator beacon technology of the early 1970s was primitive by modern standards, and if Jack's beacon had activated at all, the signal would have been too weak to detect through water and silt. The report concluded with commendations for Jack's handling of the emergency and noted that he had followed all proper procedures and that his death was the result of unfortunate circumstances beyond his control rather than pilot error or negligence. Vernon's aviation was cleared of any maintenance responsibility, confirming what Jack himself had stated in his final recording. The report was filed with the Federal Aviation Administration and the Montana Department of Transportation, and copies were provided to Jack's family. Closure. On June 15, 2017, Lily Perkins organized a memorial service for her father at the Culbertson Community Church, the same church where search volunteers had gathered 45 years earlier to coordinate their efforts. More than 200 people attended, including elderly residents who remembered Jack, fellow Vietnam veterans who'd known him during the war, and current members of the Montana Air National Guard who came to honor one of their own. Sheriff Anderson gave a brief speech describing the recovery effort and the discovery of Jack's final message. Lily spoke about her father, not the broken man who'd returned from Vietnam, but the man he'd been before the war and the father he'd tried to be, despite his wounds. She talked about how he'd taught her to ride a bicycle, how he'd helped her with math homework even though numbers didn't come easily to him, how he'd made pancakes every Sunday morning in the shape of Mickey Mouse. She read excerpts from his final recording, her voice breaking only slightly when she reached the part where he'd spoken directly to her, and told the assembled mourners that knowing her father had loved her enough to spend his last moments thinking of her was a gift she'd carry for the rest of her life. Jack Brennan's remains were buried in the Culbertson Cemetery with full military honors. 7 Montana Air National Guard helicopters flew over in missing man formation, the roar of their rotors echoing across the prairie. The tape recording was transcribed and archived with the NTSB report, a permanent record of a pilot's final moments and a father's final words. The Bell 47G's registration number was formally retired, ensuring that November 3847 Golf would never be assigned to another aircraft. Lily returned to her life in Great Falls with a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in 45 years. The not knowing had been worse than any truth could be, and while the pain of loss remained, it was no longer the open wound it had been when her father had simply vanished. She kept the photograph of him beside his Huey on her desk at work, and occasionally she would play the digital copy of his final recording when she needed to hear his voice. Her sons grew up knowing the story of their grandfather, the helicopter pilot who'd survived a war only to die in a Montana snowstorm, and who'd spent his final moments making sure his daughter knew she was loved. Legacy. In the years following the discovery, the story of Jack Brennan and his recovered final message attracted attention from aviation safety organizations and veterans groups. The Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association published an article about the incident in their quarterly journal, noting it as one of many cases where Vietnam-era pilots had continued serving their communities after the war, often in dangerous civilian roles that didn't receive the recognition their military service had. The article emphasized that Jack's calm professionalism in the face of certain death exemplified the training and character of the thousands of helicopter pilots who'd served in Southeast Asia. Aviation historians use Jack's case as an example when discussing improvements in emergency locator beacon technology and search and rescue procedures. The fact that his wreckage had remained undiscovered for 45 years, despite extensive searches, highlighted the challenges of locating downed aircraft in remote areas with difficult terrain and weather conditions. Modern GPS-based locator systems and satellite tracking have made such disappearances less likely, though they still occur occasionally in wilderness areas. For the residents of Culbertson, Jack Brennan's story became part of the town's history, remembered not just as a tragedy, but as a testament to one man's dedication to his daughter and his community. A small plaque was installed at Vernon's Aviation's former location, now a grain storage facility, commemorating Jack and other pilots who'd flown from the site over its decades of operation. The plaque reads simply, "In memory of Jack Brennan and all aviators who gave their lives serving this community, their courage and sacrifice will not be forgotten." Lily lived to see her own grandchildren grow, and she made sure they knew about their great-grandfather, not sanitizing his struggles or the demons he'd fought after Vietnam, but presenting him as a complete person, flawed and wounded but ultimately heroic in the ways that mattered most. When her eldest grandson enlisted in the Army in 2025, she gave him the metal lighter that had been recovered from the wreckage, the one engraved with Jack's unit insignia from Vietnam. "He survived the war," she told her grandson, "and he came home and tried his best to be a good father despite everything he'd been through. That's all we can ask of anyone, that they try their best with whatever they've been given." The tape recording remained in the NTSB archives, but Lily authorized the release of a transcript for educational and historical purposes. It has since been used in aviation safety courses as an example of proper emergency procedures, and in counseling programs for veterans dealing with post-traumatic stress, demonstrating that even in moments of extreme crisis, the love between parent and child can transcend fear and provide comfort. Researchers studying the psychological aspects of survival situations have analyzed Jack's calm demeanor during the recording, noting how his military training enabled him to maintain composure even as he faced drowning. Every December 14th, on the anniversary of Jack's disappearance, Lily places flowers at his grave in the Culbertson Cemetery. The headstone, granite polished to a mirror shine, bears his name, his dates of service in Vietnam, and a simple epitaph she chose after hearing his final words. "Beloved father, he flew home." She stands there in the Montana cold, often alone but sometimes accompanied by her children or grandchildren, and she listens to the wind that comes down from Canada across the empty plains. The same wind that was blowing that December morning in 1972. She thinks about the 12-year-old girl she was, waiting at the kitchen table for a father who never came home. And she thinks about the man trapped in a sinking helicopter who spent his last breath telling that girl she was loved. The pain of his loss never fully disappeared, but time and truth had transformed it into something she could carry without being crushed by it. She knows now what she couldn't have understood at 12, that her father did come home, finally, after 45 years beneath the Missouri River's dark water. Not in the way she'd hoped as a child, but in the way that mattered, with words that proved he'd never stopped being her father, never stopped loving her, even in the moment when his own life was ending. The story of Jack Brennan, the helicopter pilot who vanished in a Montana snowstorm and left a message that survived 45 years underwater, reminds us that love endures beyond tragedy, that truth matters even when it comes too late, and that the connections between parents and children transcend even death itself. In the vast emptiness of Montana, where distances swallow lives and weather erases evidence, the story of Jack Brennan proved that some truths wait patiently beneath the surface. His final message, preserved by chance and recovered by drought, transformed a mystery into a testimony of love that transcended death. For Lily and countless others who lose loved ones without answers, Jack's recorded words offered something invaluable. Not just closure, but proof that in the final moments, when everything else was stripped away, what remained was the purest form of human connection, a father's love for his daughter.